everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I'm Tony Gerdeman here, as always, with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Tony, you sent me the topic of this show, and I thought, ooh, this is a really good one. I like this one because I thought, I know what the answer is. And I thought, do I? Because it feels like there are a couple different answers that you could end up with going a couple different very interesting directions.
Yeah, the challenge of this one is finding a title that is short enough, because it's kind of a long title for YouTube. But basically, if you could guarantee an elite performance from one position group all season long for Ohio State, which position group would you choose? And I know you're all saying offensive line, and I think that's a fair answer. What I would say is, I don't think you need to have the best offensive line in the nation. And if we're going to call it elite, that's probably what you're talking about. I don't think you need to have an elite offensive line to win a national championship. However, when you've got a couple of links that aren't as strong as the others, then that can kind of derail things. But you can also have a great offensive line, but if you don't have everything else, then, kind of what good is it? So I know the majority of people are saying the offensive line. Give me an elite offensive line, and I don't care what else happens. Tom, I'm going to push back on that one.
Okay, so first of all, your title is one weird trick for Ohio State to win the national championship. That's easy. When in doubt, you just say one weird trick. That's the shortcut here, so we've solved that problem. Yeah, and offensive line was 100%. You sent it, and I thought, offensive line. And the thinking there, it's not that the offensive line is going to guarantee that they win the national championship. It's just, after last season, I think everyone would say if they'd had an elite offensive line last year, they probably would have won the national championship, because you score one more touchdown in the Indiana game and one more touchdown in the Miami game, earlier in the game where you don't have that one drive at the end. You probably win both of those games and you probably win the national championship. I think that's an area where there's uncertainty around a lot of areas. But if that's one where if you can do that, and if you have an elite offensive line, that helps your running game, that helps your passing game, that helps everything. So that was unquestionably the first answer. And I still think that's absolutely a viable answer. But I also think you could probably take any of 3 to 4 other position groups and make a decent argument for it. I think a lot of my answers are on the offensive side of the ball. So I'm going to go on the defensive side of the ball real quickly and just say it's pretty difficult to get dominated if you have a really, really elite defensive line. That is something that, boy, Ohio State fans just saw that in a couple games at the end of last season. An elite defensive line can really sort of level the playing field. Ohio State was a more talented team than Miami in an awful lot of areas last year, but Miami's defensive line really dominated that game, and that was the difference. And so, if you have an elite offensive line, yeah, that probably negates that to a certain degree. But if you have a dominant defensive line, you could think about all those. Why were those Clemson teams so great in the 2010s? Why were those Alabama teams so great in the 2010s? They all had real good defensive lines. And if you had, and I think there's a real possibility that this is a very, very good to potentially elite Ohio State defensive line this year regardless, because I think they've added some really, really good pieces. And I think Kenyatta Jackson is sort of primed for a big season. And boy, James Smith could really have a pretty big season. And Quay Russaw could really do some exciting things, and on and on and on. If you had an elite, really, really elite defensive line, it could sort of lock that in and guarantee that. I think that would make a pretty big difference in terms of this year's Ohio State team as well.
I think an elite offensive line gives you a lot of leeway offensively to just that gives everybody the upper hand offensively, and it allows your quarterback to maybe look a little bit longer or find some lanes to run. The running backs, absolutely a better offensive line. But I think, as we've said previously, everybody's a year older, so I think everybody's a year better. If the offensive line is a year better than they were last year, that may make them elite. if they're as good as they were last year, I still think that's good enough. It just you it does depend on matchups. Like any other tournament that goes on, matchups are gonna factor in. Defensive line is kind of where I lean. If you look at the 2002 defensive line, national champions, Darian Scott and Will Smith at defensive end, Kenny Peterson and Tim Anderson at tackle. 2014, you had Joey Bosa and Adolphus Washington and Michael Bennett. And I'd say, and even Steve Miller. Steve Miller had an impact on that team.
Roll Tide.
2024. Yeah. There you go. At 2024, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Ty Hamilton, and Tyleek Williams. Elite and underrated at the same time, I think. If you could get something like that out of those guys, then because even last year, defensive line was very good. I don't know that it was elite because you still had like the 3-tech situation. What was a little, sometimes you didn't get as much as you wanted out of Edric Houston and Tywan Malone. Cade McDonald was awesome. If you could get an elite level, I mean, there's just so much disruption there. It changes everything for your defense. And given that there's so much changeover on this defense, I think if I could guarantee that Ohio State's defensive line, if I can only take one defensive line or offensive line, I'm going to go with the defensive line. But we also saw last year an elite defense isn't good enough to win a national championship. So are you going to try the same thing a second time in a row and expect different results?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. The offense, my expectation is this year's offense is going to be better than last year's offense for any number of reasons. You got a returning quarterback. You've got a bunch of running backs who are now second-year running backs instead of first-year running backs. You've got an offensive line where you're bringing back just about everyone. And so you would expect a step forward in all of those areas. And Jeremiah Smith is going to be Jeremiah Smith. You got some questions elsewhere in the wide receiver unit, which kind of brings me to one of my other answers here, because I think you could take basically, ironically, in the year of the tight end, I think you could take basically any position group other than tight end on the offensive side of the ball, and you could make a case for it. I think you could make a case for quarterback. I think you could make a case for running back, and I certainly think you could make a case for wide receiver, because if Jeremiah Smith is healthy, you have elite wide receiver play, like elite wide receiver play on one side of the field. There's a little bit of a question in terms of the slot. How good is Brandon Inniss going to be? What's Kyle Parker going to be this year? What's Devin McEwen going to be this year? What kind of role can Chris Henry Jr. play this year? I mean, you've got a lot of potential answers there. If you could just go ahead and lock in stone, hey, Devin McEwen is going to be elite outside. Brandon Inniss and or Kyle Parker is going to be elite inside. Well, boy, that's a pretty intriguing offense. And, again, last year you had elite on both outside wide receiver spots because you had Carnell Tate, who went top 5 in the NFL draft and who all the NFL people are already going, holy crap, have you seen this guy? And you had that guy opposite Jeremiah Smith, and you had them more or less healthy by the time the playoffs rolled around, and that was still not enough to get you there. So, this is one where if you pick wide receiver, I feel like that raises the floor of what that position could be. But again, you had that last year, and a lot like the elite, defense last year, that didn't get you there. Well, okay, the elite wide receivers last year didn't get you there. But I do think it's really intriguing what this team might look like if you could lock that in.
Well, since we're on the offense, they had elite running back play in 2024 and went through a slew of guys on the offensive line. They did not have elite running back play last year. If they had, the Indiana game is different.
Yeah.
And if the Indiana game is different, maybe there's no Miami game that you need to even worry about. So in that way, as we parse and pick and choose what we want, if you get elite play out of the running backs, then that makes the offensive, for one, it makes the offensive line look better. And it makes Julian Sayin's life a lot easier. And I do expect the running backs to be better this year. And the way that people talk about them when you talk about them at Ohio State, this is a very good room now. And if we're not talking enough about Isaiah West, we're going to owe something, because the way people talk about him right now, get excited for him. So I think with if you have the same offensive line play last year and better running back play, I think you can win it all. So that's again more pushback for me on the offensive line thing, even though it's like I'm never going to turn down say no, you don't want elite offensive line play, but if you can get it, then like I said, it makes average running backs above average. But if you've got great running backs, then you don't need to worry about average. So I don't think the answer is running back, but I think last year it could have been. And that's why this year if you look even at the rest of the defense, I feel like you can't say elite safeties, even though I think that would go a long way. Elite corners, it's like everything starts up front. And that's why I'm going defensive line on this. Final answer, even though I could be talked into a couple of others.
Yeah, and I I think running back is an interesting answer just because I think if you put Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson on the 2025 Ohio State team, I think there's a decent chance they win the national championship again. And even with whatever, the questions in the offensive line, because boy, if you have a running game that's just a little bit better and can break a few more tackles and have a little bit more big play burst, well, how big of a difference did it make to have Travion Henderson on the field right before halftime against Texas in that Cotton Bowl? I would argue a pretty consequential difference. So, that's, I think, an area where it's a little bit of a sneaky answer. It's certainly not the first position group I thought about. But then when I got there, I thought, yeah, you could make an argument there. And I think you could make an argument for quarterback as well. And quarterback, I think you're going to have, last year they already had very good quarterback play. Was it elite? Probably at times, probably not all season. But if you have elite quarterback play, and I think that is on the table this year with Julian Sayin in his second year as a starter. If you have elite quarterback play, again, that covers for a multitude of sins. If you're finding the open guy, you're reading the defense, you're not making the big mistake in that one moment, that makes a big difference. And an elite quarterback can pick you apart almost no matter how good of a defense you have. And, pick you apart might only mean 24 points, but if you have a pretty good defense, 24 points probably wins you most of the game. So quarterback is not the answer I would give here because this is, yes, an elite quarterback would probably go a long way, but I think you're already looking at a B+ quarterback, an A- quarterback. So, you would love to, you can get your GPA up by taking your A- and turning it into an A+, but if you've got something that's like, yeah, that was a B- or a B, something like that, you can get that to an A+, well, that's going to boost your GPA a little bit more.
I've seen over the years, some average to above average quarterbacks win national championships.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen some really freaking good quarterbacks not win them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could have elite play out of Julian Sayin, but if he's not protected, if receivers aren't getting open, you wouldn't even know that that he's doing some elite things. And so, I think the Julian Sayin that we saw last year, was it good enough? No, you need to be better against the better teams. But again, last year is all new. I expect him to be better. Maybe he will be elite. And there are games in which he was elite last year against the lower level teams. But if you want to be elite, you've got to do it. I'm not saying you need to be 85% completion against Texas or whatever, but you need to make teams pay, and you need to be the difference in a win or a loss. You need to be able to make some plays when they need to be made. And if they can get that out of him this year as an addition, that may make him elite. It'll make him better, and I think that's good enough. And but boy, I'm really leaning on this running back answer now because it's hard to ignore what happened last year and some of the yards that were left out there. And if they get those yards this year, it seems like such a fantasy football answer, though. Like it's not a real. Everything is up. Football starts up front, Tom. It's a line of scrimmage game, and the NFL people are like running backs. Who needs them? I mean, what? Everybody needs them, but why would you put that much stock in them? But boy, I'm not going to say running back because it makes me sound football dumb. But last year, I mean, look at the last 2 years. That's all I'm saying. That's if I was a lawyer That would be my closing argument, and then I'd be like, and then tell the judge, you're the law talking guy.
Yeah, your closing argument is come on, come on, come on, and yeah, that and listen, it's erudite as always, unquestionably, but yeah, it's an interesting argument because you wouldn't normally say that for almost any team, but specifically last year's Ohio State team, I think you could argue offensive line, I think you could argue running back, I think you could argue wide receiver for this year's team, I think you could argue, you can certainly quarterback is never a bad answer. And I think either side of the ball in the trenches is always a safe answer. I don't know that it's always the right answer, but it's always a safe answer. You're never going to have someone go, "You moron," if you have decades of college football coaches who will. I go back to Earl Bruce being in the press box and pounding the table, but in the row behind us, you got to run the ball. You're gonna. I mean, like, yeah. I talked to Bo Schembechler about this up in Detroit 20 years ago. You got to be able to run the ball. You got to win their line of scrimmage. These are guys who won a lot of football games, and they all said the same thing. And at some point, it's probably not a complete coincidence. You do have to win the game in the trenches. So I don't think either of those is a bad answer. And I don't think running back is the answer that I would probably land on ultimately. But it's also not as crazy an answer as you might think. I think I'm going to go with defensive line as my final answer here. But honestly, almost any of the things that we've talked about, I could kind of go, yeah, I could certainly make an argument for that.
I agree. We're right about everything that we've said. Very well. Very
wrong
well
about football, especially the college football Hall of Famers.
I'm with you on defensive line. That's what I'm choosing as well. Because I think, and we're not going to do this now, but when was the last time a national title winner had a pretty good defensive line? You need something more than pretty good. Indiana, great scheme, and they were deep as heck because they would lose guys and just plug new guys in. And I think you can win it with a pretty good offensive line. I don't know. I think you need more than that at defensive line. So I'll throw it out to the people. I'll throw it out to the audience. I know you already chose offensive line. Are you sure about that? Did you take your finger off the checker? Have we convinced you otherwise? I know that we have not. And I know that you have now put 3 more exclamation points on your offensive line answer. But is Tom crazy for saying running backs? Leave your feedback. Hit the thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel. If you're listening, you can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@BuckeyeInsiders. Thank you guys all for the support. Thank you for the comments. We always appreciate that. That will do it from here. Everybody have a great day.